So why don't we just start with a very, very quick round of quick introductions to keep this moving, like, hi, I'm from this company, and then we'll move into some of the questions and conversation. How we do.
Sounds good. My name is Ben Adams. I work with Phylos Bioscience. We're a cannabis genomics company based out of Portland, Oregon in the United States.
My name is Arash Moghani. I'm the CTO at Avicanna. We're a Toronto-based biopharma company located at the Johnson & Johnson Innovation Incubator J-Labs, and we also cultivate in Colombia. So we do R&D and cultivation.
My name is Sheldon Croone. I'm with Biotechnologies, founder, president, and CEO. We produce and process cannabis in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada as a licensed producer, and we're currently opening operations in Denmark and the UK.
So I'm just going to ask like a novice question here. When you think of like biotech in the cannabis industry, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean research? Does it mean labs? Does it mean testing? Does it mean growing? Does it mean formulations? What exactly does that mean?
I think it's probably going to mean something different to each one of us, and probably specific to what we each do. And so biotechnology in cannabis to me means breeding, essentially. Intensive breeding.
So when you say breeding, I mean that's like what, separating the girls from the boys, and then like.
If you want to do that dynamic, I guess. I'd say more that the varieties available on the market today specifically are going to be like Model T cars within 5 years. They'll be completely outdated and totally useless in many ways.
When you say that, what can you give specifics?
Oh, sure, yeah. So cannabis itself has never undergone intensive breeding efforts, and so because of the ways that the laws have changed, many biotechnology companies, including Phylos, which has collected the most genetic data on cannabis in the world, can now do intensive breeding programs. So we can breed in agronomic traits to this plant, and not just breed for high THC or ICBD. So we can breed for specific flowering times, specific cannabinoid levels.
Yield, right?
Yield, of course, yeah. It's the baseline for any.
I'll butt in on that as well. I think
Please.
it's the breeding, and for me it's a bit of breeding, but also the formulations attached to basically what you breed for. So if you want a different amount of cannabinoids of a specific compound, say it's CBG for instance, you can breed for the CBG. And what you've said is true. Certain genetics on the market today will be probably obsolete in a few years from now, just because of the amount of breeding that's going on right now and breeding for specific cannabinoid profiles. What happens then is in the formulation side of things, which is what we specialize in, it's important to realize that the genetics really dictates what you can pull out as your ultimate yield from that particular strain or cultivar, as I prefer to call them. I'm sure you do too.
Okay.
So essentially, the way I look at biotech right now, in this industry at least, is that it's really about what you can grow or basically breed for, then what you can pull out of that plant, and then formulate from the specific compounds that you bred for.
Isn't that kind of related? I mean, I'm going to ask, right, so isn't that kind of related? So if you have a landrace strain, which is, I guess, the interest in that, are landrace strains better for what you can pull out of them than turn into? I mean, that's what does that lead you in the direction for?
I wouldn't say that necessarily. I'd say that they have unique synthase pathways that maybe modern varieties don't, so there's a lot to learn from them. But I would say that the interest in landrace is more mobility opposed to anything else at this
What
point.
do you mean?
Production-wise, the landrace strains are not going to be very useful. I mean, they could take very long to flower. They may produce very low cannabinoid content. I'd say, again, it's more about mobility and maybe the baseline for breeding programs.
Okay, so this is what I just heard actually. I think it was a Thai company or maybe it was basically an Asian company. I think it was either Australia or New Zealand or from that part of the world who actually had started to engage in trying to find new landrace across Asia and Latin America in particular. Why would a company do that? I mean, because they want to breed, they're in the medical side of things. Why would somebody do that?
Again, those unique synthase pathways that don't exist in modern varieties. So Phylos, my company, we essentially started as a project with the American Museum of Natural History in New York. We sequenced about 1,000 landrace varieties from over 80 different countries, but most of those were from university herbariums, so they existed pre-prohibition, so they were from the late 1800s to the 1960s, essentially.
So what you guys are doing is basically creating documentation and testing for the cannabis formulations of tomorrow, whether that's your plant or whether that's the liquid in your jar, or the stuff in your medical device, or the stuff in your soda or beer, basically. You guys are the formulations, the foundations of that industry, right?
Yeah, so to answer your previous question of what I think of the biotech industry is, there's a big misconception in this industry that when a jurisdiction is legal and you have a plant that's natural, it equals to a safe and effective product, and that's not the case. So for me...
Can you give an example?
So for an example, it could be that you can have an oil tincture sitting on a shelf right now for a medical patient, and you don't know if there's stability testing on that product. So meaning that that product is actually stable for the past 3 months. If the cannabinoid content is still there, if it's not degraded, or even if it could be toxic. There's not real testing really done in the industry, and that's something that we're trying to bridge the gap. And that's why the medical community has been so distant or not open-minded to, prescribing medical cannabis for patients. And, bringing that education in play requires data and rigorous testing. You need to do formulation work, you need to do QC work, QA work, you need to do analytical tests, preclinical tests, in vitro, in vivo testing. This is the type of stuff that at a basic level we need to bridge that gap between for the medical community from a physician perspective as well as the patient perspective.
I'd say if cannabis innovation is a Maslow hierarchy of needs, then breeding is the baseline of that pyramid, and then formulation would go up from there, essentially.
That's right, the testing, and that's what you're getting at, is the testing really then proves the efficacy of those cannabinoids that you're, say, breeding for, and we're breeding for. And then testing in the labs, which is so important, because really what we're trying to do in the end, at least for us being entirely medical focused, is making sure that what we produce and put on the market as a formulation or a flower, even in certain markets where we can't, say, distribute a formulation, it's important to make sure that the patient is getting the outcome they're looking for. And really that comes down to the cannabinoid profile of the flower or the profile of the formulation, and of course the stability of that formulation.
All of this is very fascinating, but the next question is, how would you guys say this ties into things like GMP? Now, for those of you who don't know what GMP is, right, it's a standard here in Europe that applies to, it's good manufacturing practice, and it's like a seed to sale quality test. How does what you guys do tie into that discussion?
It creates a standard, global standard that, when you're following certain types of protocols and practices, and as a cultivator in Colombia, there is a stigma around the Colombian market. But when you say you're, like for us, we're GACP, going to be GAP, so good agricultural practices. So we're going to be producing these products with these international standards and then manufacturing them with GMP standards as well. It creates some sort of level of comfort and a level of sophistication, because you could say I'm a cultivator in Colombia, and well, some people might think you're growing in the jungle and, as like an illegal market, but that's not the case, right? There's it adds that prestigious level and creates a high quality of the active pharmaceutical ingredient that we treat the cannabinoids as.
Okay, so I'm also trying to get some reaction from the audience. Can I have a hands up? Who in the audience is actively engaged in this kind of environment or this kind of activity in Europe? Is there anybody in the room? If we can get a microphone to you, are you hearing things from the folks here, from non-European sources? And I know you're global as well, but what I'm curious about is how this discussion has differed so far from the conversation in Europe on these. Do you have any insight on that?
It's hard. Will do. Thank you. It's hard to give an estimate over here, since there's very, very few companies who do so or specialize in this kind of R&D activities. Don't take this for granted. Maybe I just don't know about all the companies that are active in this field. However, what we're focusing on is fairly similar to what you guys do. So I think it's, in a way, on par.
So do you think, I'm going to bounce this back, so because my perspective sitting here, this seems to be the groundwork of the next, certainly the medical discussion, right? So if a doctor knows that they're prescribing this brand that is proven to be stable and you've gone through the tests and it's treated like a pharmaceutical, that's a great discussion. But then there's the flip side, and those of us in the room who are older than probably 35 remember this horrible fear that sort of came out of the old-timey or industry of like, oh my God, my strain is going to be bought up by Monsanto, to name one company, and they're going to rule the world, and then cannabis is going to go into another strain-controlled world, and how scary.
I guess I'll. So, when you're talking about types of specific indications that people are suffering from, and they're already using different types of pharmaceutical products, right? So, in our field, we take it very seriously as well. So there has to be a level of sophistication. You don't want to give someone an oil tincture that you say, oh, this oil tincture works for epilepsy, and they have a bad reaction. So this is why you treat it at this serious level. It's a social responsibility for everyone who's in this space. As much as people think it's a new economy that's being built, and it's a very interesting, fast-growing industry. But you still need to have that responsibility that if you are going to put products out there, that they should be properly tested.
I agree entirely. I think the global reputation is on all of our shoulders right now.
Well, that's my question. I mean, is it being really regulated? I mean, certainly in Europe, if you're a medical product, if you're a pharmaceutical product, there are testing and other things that go along with it that are mainstreamed into this discussion. Is this regulation discussion saying that on the biotech front, certainly in the American hemisphere, what you guys are doing is ahead of the regulation? I mean, that...
For me, being in this industry for about 3.5 years, the European market feels like Canada 3.5 years ago. So we are trying to... Well, the good thing about being in Canada as well, and being based in Canada, is from being the first G7 country to legalize marijuana for not just medicinal but recreational. The one good thing is that we could do R&D at a federal level, and we can do clinical trials at a federal level. So these are Health Canada approved testing that has a level of sophistication globally. In the U.S., unfortunately, cannabis is not considered. It's considered a controlled drug, so it's illegal from a federal level, which limits the Americans to do any R&D and clinical development, so they can't necessarily generate real actual data and market that data or use that data in their production or on R&D. So in Germany, what I've noticed is now is like, because it's such a young industry here, or in Europe I should say, then it's still growing and it's in the early stages. There's a lot of room for growth, and to add that level of sophistication just makes it that much better for medical practitioners in Europe to bridge that gap and be more comfortable prescribing medical cannabis.
So I'm going to push this one again, and I'm going to come back to you now. Where is this in another example of the industry being ahead of the regulatory environment, or when you call cannabis, say, a medical product, does it slot into the testing environment, even in the United States, even before federal reform, because there's something called the FDA. This is our narcotic. It will probably be a Schedule II. I mean, all those things are coming.
I'm going to go back quickly to the intellectual property and GMP factors, because I think that GMP, first off, good manufacturing practices for the European Union, which is essentially, at least right now in the cannabis industry, the highest level. It's similar to what you might do in a pharmaceutical industry. That's, I believe, important, because if you focus on that and you're manufacturing to that level, you're going to always get a consistent product for the patient, which means you're going to, of course, be able to provide things like the stability data and other things that I personally believe is important if you're selling a medical product. You can do that with flour even, but it just takes time, basically proving that stability. But it's important, if you have the right flour, then you can still potentially make that the right medicine. Now, intellectual property, a whole complex ball, I should say, basically, because it's kind of difficult to register certain things like cultivars. In fact, in the U.S., it's
Hold
very
on,
difficult.
what's a cultivar?
A cultivar is a strain. It's just the proper way to say it. So the scientific term would be cultivar. The black market called it a strain, but actually, if you talk to any of my breeders, they'd say cultivar. and they'd actually
Well, just anybody over like 35. It's a strain.
Okay, so it's a strain.
Sure,
It's
yeah.
a strain.
Strain refers more to like bacteria. So
Yeah, exactly. A strain's actually a plant virus, so cultivar is a little bit more, if I can get everyone here saying cultivar, that's what I'm going to do.
variety
Cultivar.
works too. You could say
Variety, yeah, that works. But so intellectual property is something that's very hard to register when it comes to plants. The Monsanto model, a bit of an odd model, but they did pretty good at it. But if you look at some other companies that are doing similar things, what they do is effectively they register plant breeders' rights, which takes a plant breeder's permit, which takes someone who has at least 15 or so years of experience in plant breeding, which is rare. So if you can combine these two things and essentially find someone who can do that, then register those strains, and then manufacture that at a GMP level, that's essentially the future of cultivation, at least in my books. When it comes to formulation, there's a whole other aspect of intellectual property, and of course the efficacy of all those different formulations. It's
Can I
important-
interrupt? You're a wealth of information. Okay, so I'm going to jump in with one of those stupid questions. Okay, so why would I go ahead and register my strain? My cultivar, if I'm going to go ahead and just like have a processed something, which is obviously has to be tested and whatever. But if I'm just going to be making liquids or something from that and mixing and matching or whatever, certainly if I'm out of the medical space. I mean, I understand to a certain extent why this is important, but again, to my question, where are the people telling you guys what to do? Where are the regulations? Or are you guys doing this as you're going along, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but where is that?
Get a good lawyer. But I mean, really, it's very hard to actually register some of these things. It's actually more like a process patent. It's not so much of protecting the formulation itself. And then, of course, there's the trademarks and the brand associated to that particular product. That's probably the key takeaway from that. That's your IP, really. Not so much that you've just combined CBD and some particular, flavonoid or something. So it's really about the process of how you derive that, then how did you put it together, and then if you can protect that in some way, that's a way to secure some IP. And even in the U.S., it's a way to secure IP in a place where it's not completely federally legal. In Europe, you can do it as well. It's just only in certain places right now because THC you can't work with in certain countries.
Okay, so I'm going to do a quick hands up. I'm going to keep you active. All right, hands up in the audience. Who is kind of like bugged? I mean, not like, a professional, whatever, but just on a visceral level. Who is bugged? You need a time out? Is that it?
No, I'm crazy bugged by this whole conversation, man.
Awesome. So there's one. So hands up. Who is bugged by this conversation? Hands up. Or is people that's like sleeping? Who is like profoundly worried right now about the fact that private companies, no offense, because these guys are really smart, private companies are creating IP. This is intellectual property that is protected in cannabis. Hands up. Well, there are a couple. Why?
I'll tell you why. It's the old hippie in me. First of all, cannabis has been decentralized for a very long time, right? It's hundreds of thousands of growers all over the world, all creating their own little strains, all doing their own little thing. And as we move toward these giant corporations, and capitalism loves to capitalize, right? Everybody wants to own the whole market. Everybody wants to be a monopoly. Everybody wants to, we own Trainwreck. We invented OG Kush. These sort of things.
I've got Girl Scout cookies though, baby.
Right? Whatever it is. These sort of things sometimes seem to me to be the opposite of how cannabis culture has evolved. And I understand that the world changes, and I understand that business is business, but how do you patent a plant? What's going to stop people from saying you have to, like I said, you have to grow these seeds, you have to buy these seeds from us all the time?
Surprisingly, I'm actually very anti-capitalist. But to make the hippie
your
and you
money.
very happy, we actually, I think we've collected about now 3,000, or sequenced the DNA of about 3,000 plants from 84 countries to date. And that most of that data has been uploaded to the Open Cannabis Project and the NCBI. So we are currently fighting utility patents and creating data space to fight future utility patents.
What's a utility patent? Can you just
It's
explain?
just a broad scoping patent on a particular plant. Sheldon will actually probably know.
Like
a little bit more than I would.
I've got the strain and you can't use it and I can sue your butt.
But varieties like OG Kush, Trainwreck, things that were on the market today can never be patented and they never will be, nor should they be.
Can
No.
I make a quick?
Go ahead.
So there's a landmark U.S. Patent Office ruling. I think it's a 2013 ruling. It's Myriad versus someone else that basically says that anything that's natural, any plant or anything, any DNA, any genetics that existed naturally cannot be patented. But if you have modified the genetics in the lab, you can patent that. So anything that existed up until now naturally cannot be patented. The process to extract, to do whatever you want to do can be patented, but the genetics itself cannot be. And everybody in the world pretty much uses that ruling, which was a big Supreme Court case in 2013.
So my question then is, so what you guys are doing, while important and cool, and like the land race discussion is awesome, right? Is what you're doing really for the pharmaceutical market? I mean, I can certainly see an application, or is this really for the recreational folks who are like, you know what, this is my beer, this is my gin, this is my cigarette, this is my da-da-da. I mean, where do you really see this being applied? The commercial recreational space or medical? And be honest.
Specifically for Phylos, it's both medical and recreational. That's why we're in multiple markets today, from Canada, Colombia, Spain, all of the United States. I'd say it's both in that sense. Pharmaceutical will definitely be a larger market in the future, and that's where breeding for novel cannabinoids will come into play, but I'd say recreation is still a big part of it as well too.
I mean, I have to agree. I mean, I look at what happened in Canada with legalization. I think the recreational is in the future probably going to be a big part of the market. Atlas is focused on medical, so because we focus on the formulations and the efficacy of those formulations, that's really where we focus our efforts. But I do see a huge opportunity in the recreational markets, and I think a company like yours is going to do very well with that.
Well, I'm going to throw another one in here. Okay, so those of you who are in Europe know about this whole novel foods discussion, right? So if you guys are like registering all these strains, for those of you who don't know what novel foods is, the European Union has regulations that say that any plant-based material, and you can, if you know a better definition, please criticize me later, but basically the European Union says that any plant-based material that makes its way into human food that was not in common use before, I believe, 1997, has to go through a special regulation process. And of course, CBD in particular in food right now is falling into that discussion across Europe. So how is what you guys are doing, and maybe if you don't know, that's fine, how is what you guys are doing going to help or aid or hold back or hinder that novel food discussion here in the EU?
I can definitely speak to that, because I think that for us, being able to infuse our isolated compounds, proven compounds that we know are consistent and dosed properly, is a huge part of what would make people comfortable having an infused product of any sort, be it a beverage or an edible product. And I think that for Europe, having this big debate right now with regards to CBD and how it should be produced and how it should be distributed, I think it's important that being something that many people consider medical, and I personally consider medical, it's important that it goes through the right processing, the checks and balances, to make sure that what you purchase is actually what you get. And I guess that's an issue I've seen in a lot of places, including in some parts of the US where there's less regulatory environment. And you get a product, in fact, we tested 30 products, CBD products, or claimed to be CBD. And out of 30, there was actually just a fraction that even contained CBD, and only 3 that actually had the amount that they said they did. So to me, that regulatory environment that's going to oversee what's going to be an infused product is important. And how it was produced, and is it clean, is it real? That's also important.
Okay, so any questions from the audience? Any thoughts? Okay, there's one over here.
Over here and then down there.
I have a question. The new strains you develop, they can cross in nature with the original hemp strains. So we can see it in the corn industry or corn farming, that the natural strains no more exist in the world because the artificial strains crossed in the fields with the natural strains, and so the natural strains, they have been here maybe 30 years ago, you can never find in the planet anymore. And I'm afraid that this danger will expand worldwide with the hemp too. And the old wise plant, our hemp, will disappear from planet.
I agree.
I totally agree with you. And I think preserving seed diversity, particularly in cannabis, hemp, same thing, is very important. During the 20th century, we saw a massive decline in the diversity of seeds available, which is what you're speaking about. I think only maybe 10% of the original varieties that existed 100 years ago are still available today.
There's only one kind of banana, damn near.
I
in the
know,
whole
I know.
world. And we're
Yes.
going to run out of those in 20 years.
Yeah, so we have to avoid monoculture. And I think part of what Phylos has done, at least with working with the American Museum of Natural History on a project called the Cannabis Evolution Project, is about identifying and then preserving the seed diversity. And so that's actually where small growers around the world will come in, and they will be the powerhouses that preserve this diversity of cannabis we see today. Which absolutely needs to exist. And as we move ever forward, we have to remember where we came from always.
And I couldn't agree more, honestly, about preserving those strains and making sure that, first off, the breeders, the Jedis of the industry that have been around forever, that they've really been the ones who have defined the industry today. And it's important that they're recognized. And that's where these strains and strain names and other things, cannabis and hemp, really, it's important to recognize who originally brought these to the market, who's been producing these, and then we don't forget that, because we don't want to wind up in a situation where everything goes away, like bananas, for instance, which you're right, they are going to go away at some point.
Well, that was my question about the regulatory environment. I mean, I think it is lagging, and those are issues, obviously. So the next question.
One last question. I'm sorry, we're running out of time.
Yes, early this year, a team from Berkeley have used synthetic biology to produce purified THC and CBD using yeast as a vector. So I'm wondering how you, as traditional breeder, are considering this successful new advance, which will be one of many others in the next year.
I mean, I think we all saw Raphael Moshulam's talk yesterday. At least I hope we did. I think it's impossible to get those genetically engineered yeast varieties to produce the same level of compounds that cannabis can today.
Talk to the research kings in Dortmund, Germany, man. They would disagree with you about that one.
Well, they were talking about, I mean, just producing THC, cannabis is the whole entourage effect,
Exactly.
right? It's not just the THC, it's the CBD, the CBG, the CBN, the myrcene, the
And
blah, 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 blah,
the
blah.
cost
blah,
to produce those isolates from yeast is extraordinary. It's absurd to do that way.
Might as well just grow weed, like
Grow
a
a real
regular
plant.
person. Yeah. Okay, I think. Nope, sorry. The boss says no. I'm sorry, but of course, as always, you can all huddle in the hallway and have heated debate and discussion and coffee. We thank you very much. Let's hear it
Thank
for
you all.
Benjamin and Sheldon and Arash and Marguerite.